words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Well, at first glance, today's readings appear to offer us a vision of utopia on the one hand and a pretty disastrous dystopia on the other. If we look at the history of humankind, the reality seems to be that any utopia or ideal world that we can imagine inevitably becomes disastrously dystopian fairly rapidly. And arguably, the significant causes of the transition from the one to the other are the human characteristics of ambition, a lust for wealth and power, and all for their own sakes. And these are the fundamental building blocks of self-interest, narcissism, greed, and social division. It's appropriate, I think, on Remembrance Sunday to consider these somewhat depressing themes. And it's also appropriate because the readings of the day take us into that territory. With the Gospel, we've got all that threatening stuff, and with Isaiah, we've got what appears to be an image of utopia. And so, of course, does the quotation from Monty Python. It's one of my favourite Pythonisms, actually, although it's not my absolute favourite. My absolute favourite comes from The Life of Brian. The bloke, and you probably remember him, the whole crowd is shouting with one voice, "I'm an individual!" No, they're not. But then this little voice pipes up, "I'm not!" Just to make the point that really we do not know what we're doing most of the time. But however, I'm not even going to apologise for using sort of Monty Python as the sort of the title for today. I reckon it's pretty good. Anyway, the end of civilization as we know it is one of those sayings that can resonate with people of any generation. It can be either positive or negative. Most of the time we think it's negative, I suspect, because it usually conveys grief about all the good things that we've lost or we're losing rapidly or over time. And this can be especially true of things that as a society we may regard as fundamental to who we are. Things that we might regard as cultural icons, if you like. Perhaps like the church, you may be thinking. If we look at the Gospel for today, we see such an example. Luke tells us that presumably when Jesus hears some people admiring the glories of the temple in Jerusalem, he observes that they better make the most of it here and now, because it will soon be gone. It'll be destroyed, shattered, not a wall standing. In fact, one wall will survive, and it still does. We know it today as the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. But the destruction of the temple will be preceded by rumours and reports of wars, famines, plagues, and various other disasters, natural and man-made. And they in turn will be accompanied by alarming events in the natural world and also by religious persecutions. We've probably all heard of some cult or other whose members read such texts as this and signs as these and match them to the reality they see around them, and then they proclaim, "The end of the world is nigh," and either people will gather vast amounts of food and rush off into caves to hide, or they'll just sort of basically mock the whole thing. A sketchy acquaintance with human history will remind us that this is a recurrent reality. And in our history today, such a situation again seems to be all too real. You must have been hiding under a rock if you don't know about the number of conflicts in the world, the amount of poverty, the breaking famines, and so on. They're all similar to what Luke is saying. And the third last sentence of the reading is none too encouraging, but it's demonstrably real. That's the one that says, you'll be hated by all because of my name. You think about the society in which we live. The church is slowly, and not so slowly in some circles, being expunged as far as it can be. There are people who would claim to be Christians, but not publicly, for fear of what might happen to them. It's almost like we're living in the 1st century, not the 21st. But then, as Luke tells us, Jesus concludes, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your souls. And today I think sometimes we fall into one or two categories. Either we're worried about surviving now, so we're not too worried about our souls, or we can't quite believe it anyway. But these things happen. Now, some of you were here some weeks ago, I think, when the Reverend Martin Dahl was here, and you might remember that she focused on the experience of the Israelites during their period of exile in Babylon. Part of her sort of project was to make sure that we knew the difference between the Exodus on the one hand and the exile on the other. As part of the obliteration of Israel as a nation by Nebuchadnezzar, Solomon's temple was destroyed utterly, and the sacred objects contained in the Ark of the Covenant were carried away to Babylon as war booty. In destroying the temple, Nebuchadnezzar effectively destroyed the culture and faith of the people, because the temple symbolised their life, their faith, and their hope. That temple, known as the First Temple or Solomon's Temple, had been built in Jerusalem by Solomon in about the 10th century before the Christian era. And the city of Jerusalem itself had for much longer than that already been a sacred site. That was one of the reasons that David had acquired the city and built his temple there. It was meant to be a permanent site for the Ark of the Covenant, which held the stone tablets of the law received by Moses. And the Ark had travelled with the people, together with the tablets inside it, throughout the Exodus, wandering all over the area that was later to become Palestine and part of it Israel. So the Ark had travelled always with them as the evidence that God was with them. For the temple then to have been destroyed and the Ark stolen was for them an unmitigated disaster. It meant that God was no longer with them. Fortunately, God didn't see it that way. And as we can read in the later prophets, like we've been reading in Haggai, for example, Nebuchadnezzar's successor, Cyrus, do not try and say that fast, returned the people to Israel and ordered them to rebuild the temple. And that rebuilding lasted from about 538 to 515 before the Common Era. And the Ark of the Covenant was returned to the Holy of Holies, the most sacred part of the temple, and could be accessed only by the high priests on the Day of Atonement each year. But the symbol was there. God was back. This second temple is often called Herod's temple. And doesn't this often happen? The people put all the work in over about 200 years, and they continue to worship there. Herod comes along and over about 20 or 30 years sort of upgrades it, puts new facades on, changes it a bit, so his name goes on it. So the second temple is called Herod's temple because of that. And this is the Herod who was appointed because he was partly Jewish, king of that area of the Roman Empire. And he died about the year 4 before the Common Era. And the temple works had finished about 20 or so years earlier than that. That temple lasted until it was destroyed by the Roman general Titus in 70 AD or 70 in the Common Era, whichever set of figures you want to use. Following the destruction of this temple, Judaism then evolved from a temple-based faith that relied on daily sacrifices to God into a mobile faith that resolved around the Mosaic law, Torah, and prayer. So God is no longer sort of seen as stuck in one place, but moves with the people and within the people. Local synagogues replaced the single temple, but still recalled the temple's Holy of Holies, or the sanctuary, by always being physically oriented in the direction of Jerusalem. And prayer rituals and so on took the place of the animal sacrifices. So, in the time of Jesus' warning, we can see the developing transition between temple worship and synagogue worship. People still come to the temple on high days or feast days, but otherwise they worship in their local synagogues, and God is everywhere. But back to the readings. This is not a "and they lived happily ever after" story. Ultimately, as I said, the second temple is destroyed, all but the Wailing Wall. However, none of that undermines the truth of the reading from Isaiah. And it's not usual to do the gospel then go backwards, but it works in this case. In that reading, we hear the voice of God speaking, and it carries a message of hope. And hope is the key for us. The alternative to hope is fear. And we can either fear the future, and possibly even the present, or we can have hope in the promises of God. I'm not going to read the whole passage again, for which you may truly be thankful, but you can do that yourself, either after lunch or next week. But just a few verses. God says, "For I am about to create new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind. But be glad and rejoice forever in what I am creating." Before they, in other words, before the people, call, I will answer. And while they're yet speaking, I will hear. The wolf and the lamb will feed together. The lion shall eat straw like an ox. But the serpent, its food shall be dust. They, any of the predatory animals, anything that predates, shall not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, says the Lord. I think that means we can trust that the promise of God, that promise of God, which is to say we can have faith that God's promise will become reality. As I was thinking about this during the week, two other things struck me. First was a comment in an article written by Nikki Gemmell in the Australian Weekend magazine last weekend. And she referenced the Australian singer-songwriter Nick Cave, and I have to admit that's about all I know about Nick Cave. He's a singer-songwriter. And he said, and these are his words, "As far back as I can remember, I've always had a deep interest in religion. But the biggest problem I find with religion is the certainty of belief, which tends ultimately to lead to a kind of moral superiority or dogmatism." And that's the end of his quote. But that comment reminded me of a second thing. Something else I'd heard or read a little while earlier. Someone, and I can't now remember who it was or what the context was, but someone commented on what the modern church had done with Martin Luther's statement based on Ephesians 2 verse 8. And the statement that is, "By grace you are saved through faith." Whoever it was made the point that faith is not certainty. But the modern church has pretty much made it so. And in that regard, I have to say I'm with Nick Cave. That sort of certainty, which can breed arrogance, should not be part of what the church is about. And it's interesting that if you have a certainty of that kind, you don't need faith. Think about it. I believe that we can absolutely trust God. But other than through Jesus and the scriptures, we cannot claim to know the entirety of God with certainty. It's all about faith. And if we read Hebrews 11 verses 1 and 3 in particular, we recognise that faith, and I'm quoting, is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And by faith, we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was made from things that are not visible. Which basically to me means we still need faith. Paul goes on to list a series of august individuals who lived by faith in the truth of God. Abel, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Moses, Rahab, and many more. The women don't get much of a gig in this, but we can, if we have to, live with that. So I guess the challenge for us is, can we accept by faith that God has a plan for our futures, for good and not for evil, to quote Jeremiah? Are we prepared for the changes that are almost certainly inevitable as we wander on towards the surprising and good things that may come from the end of civilization as we know it, or as we think we know it? Amen. Now, in case I disturb you too much, we can restore the equilibrium now with a nice hymn which is on the screen, or will be in front of you. Be still my soul. But don't get too comfortable. I'm still here.